Well, welcome to yet another of the talks organized by MBRAS. To begin with, a reminder that the last MBRAS talk, In Search of a Nation's Lost History, alerted us to the aspects left out. An incomplete perspective from the existing master narrative delivered by mainstream writers. On 25th June 2002, Sofian Yahya spoke about how the pre-Malacca Sultanate past has largely been ignored. For instance, the Lembah Bujang civilization. However, not by USM archaeologists who have been actively writing about their recent findings and showcasing artifacts found in Sungai Batu in the Bujang Valley. There is, in fact, a substantial historiography on the Hindu-Buddhist archaeological site, Kerker, around about 5th century CE, with discoveries of iron smelting dated even earlier, from the 1st century CE and before, since 535 BCE. We have videos on our MBRAS website. There's a YouTube platform for past talks. Please go to it if you are interested in this and previous talks. Next, coming to the current situation, when we look at the situation in Ukraine, we find from the backstory of the Russian leaders' view of the empire and its multiple and dramatic effects on the rest of the world. It confirms the value of history, especially following our speaker today, if it is an informed and critical post-colonial perspective. I assume you've all read the abstract, which is why you are coming to this talk tonight. When applying the analytical concept continuity and change, which has been an important part of the historian's toolbox, we find that the stories which emerge depict historical narratives which take into account diverse views from different layers of society. These would include those of the anti-colonial groups, obviously offering a lens beyond the official colonial archive. And as for continuity, we see current day elite groups applying the strategy of divide and rule, such that the colonial past is still shaping the present. Now to Professor Farish's biodata. To add to the details in the announcement, which may have drawn you to attend this talk this evening, Professor Farish has been active on the internet long before tonight. Some of you may have Googled and caught documentary series on Southeast Asia's past entitled Across Borders with Dr. Farish. So, for instance, the first episode was on Cambodia and Thailand, episode 2, China and Laos, and so on. There's also another CNA YouTube item entitled Shadows of Empire, Inventing Southeast Asia. Well, there's quite a lot if you Google Dr. Farish. So without further ado, I welcome Prof. Farish to start his talk.
Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful and thankful to all of you for attending this. Though I do not understand how or why anyone would want to attend a talk at 8:30 in the evening. I will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we can have a short discussion before I hope we can end by 9:45. Allow me to get straight to the point and sum up what I want to talk about. I will argue for the need for a continuous reading of these colonial era texts. And this is really in my own domain, where I look at colonialism in Southeast Asia in the 19th century in particular. And my own approach has been one that has combined both textual analysis, discourse analysis, and a study of colonialism and its impact on society. Of course, central to all of this is the text, yeah? And we are talking in particular, my focus has always been on the works that were written by those who were actively involved in the building of empire in Southeast Asia. And these would include not only colonial functionaries, people like Stamford, Raffles, and John Crawford or John Anderson, but also military personnel like Henry Keppel, Frank Marriott, Rodney Mundy, or missionaries and what have you. And I'm fascinated by these colonial era texts because there's a certain historicity to these texts. Anyone who reads them will immediately be struck by two things. One, how historically dated they are. Dated in the sense that when we read Raffles, when we read Crawford, when we read Mundy or Keppel or Anderson, we encounter a kind of language which seems very alien or foreign to us today. Yeah, no one, not even the most right-wing demagogue, would write the way these men did at the time. And by the way, they're all men, yeah? They're almost all men, with the exception of one or two like Isabella Bird or Emily Innes. They are all generally men. Another thing that strikes us, and this should be evident to those of us who live in the post-colonial present, is that all these men who were empire builders and conquerors of territory did not and possibly could not envisage the end of empire, right? So there's a very interesting feature to their writings, because on the one hand, they're very historical, they're historically dated, but on the other hand, in terms of the tone and tenor of what they wrote and how they wrote, there's a certain historicity to them, in the sense that empire seems timeless, it seems eternal. I think it's safe for us to assume that for men like Stamford Raffles or John Crawford, the idea that their empire would one day come to an end was something that was quite possibly beyond their horizons of possibility, something they did not entertain. The idea that empire would end one day, might end one day, is simply not there. And it follows from that because of this belief, this deep-rooted belief that empire could not end and would not end, we need, as we read these texts, we need to understand and appreciate not only the subject positions of the authors, but also the subject positions of the intended audience then. Crawford, Mundy, Keppel, all of these men were writing for a Western readership. Yeah, even when Raffles wrote The History of Java, it was not written for the Javanese. It was written for his fellow Englishmen back in England to understand and to come to know Java, their latest colonial possession, which came under British control from 1811 to 1816. Now, the reasons why I think these texts are important is because, the modalities of empire, I think, remain relevant until today. I hope to demonstrate that, as I talk tonight. The modalities of empire and empire building, the ways in which power was utilized, and power was understood in the most, broadest sense of the word, including discursive power, symbolic power, the power of representation and representation of the other. These modalities exist until today. Just look at the world around you now. Yeah, the Ukraine crisis is an entirely discursive construct. The way in which the media, the way in which political actors and agents have presented us with a thing, an event, that is entirely shaped by the language that describes it. We should be aware of the fact that just because these empires no longer exist officially, we shouldn't assume that the modalities of power, extension of power building and all that have gone as well. They remain with us until today. And that's why I do believe that these 19th century texts are important and they deserve to be read again and again. Now, the reason why I raise this is because from an academic point of view, I'm talking now as a school teacher, right? I see two main problems, or rather two challenges, not problems, but two challenges facing academics or historians like myself today when it comes to dealing with the texts of empire. The first, of course, is a very mundane one, and I think all of us are familiar with this. I mean, we live in an age where the book is now a redundant thing. Yeah, people don't read, simple as that. It's a sad fact, but people don't read. We live now, at a time in a world where millions of people are familiar with, say, even popular fiction like Lord of the Rings without having read the book, but having just watched the movie, or rather trilogy of movies, right? And so books have lost their importance or value, or the place that they once held in society. And I think this is particularly important in academia. One of the challenges that most academics face today while teaching is convincing their students to actually read their books, the books given to them in their entirety. People simply have lost the habit of reading because there are new technologies that have come to replace the book, and reading now becomes, has been reduced to, reading abbreviated versions, reading summaries, or even watching videos of summaries of books rather than actually reading the book itself. But that's a mundane problem. A deeper problem, which I find more troubling, is the fact that we also live in an age of, woke culture and political correctness and what have you. And for reasons that are too complicated for me to get into now, colonial era texts have become, I think, doubly problematic in the context of today, where we have, on the one hand, heightened awareness of issues of race, sectarianism, majoritarianism, identity politics, but on the other hand, perhaps, and some would say that this is evident, a heightened sensitivity and a reluctance or a growing sense of discomfort in dealing with painful aspects of both the past and the present. So, we live in an age of cancel culture. We live in an age where people say are saying that, certain books, certain movies should not be watched anymore. So Gone with the Wind can't be watched anymore because it's racist. I mean, I would argue the opposite. It's precisely because Gone with the Wind is such a racist movie that we have to watch it and understand it in order to understand the normalization of racism. Now, of course, colonial era texts are difficult. Yeah, they're difficult because these are texts that were written by individuals who were themselves directly implicated and directly involved in the process of empire building. Almost all of them were committed empire builders. And when set in the context of the 19th century, these were people who were very much convinced of the inevitability of empire, very much persuaded by the argument about the white man's burden, very much shaped and persuaded by pseudo-scientific theories of racial difference. I mean, remember, the 19th century was the century of both scientific racism and scientific sexism, yeah, where theories of racial difference were taught at places like Harvard, for heaven's sakes. So reading these books are not easy. And the biggest problem that I face as a school teacher, as a teacher who teaches about colonialism, is trying to get students to read these books, which are difficult to read. It's not a pleasant experience, yeah, because they are laced with some of the most racist language you can imagine when you read Raffles' History of Java, for instance, or Spencer's St. John, or what have you. But it's precisely because of that that we need to understand these texts. So what I've been trying to do, and really this talk is about, the work that I do and why I would like to advocate the approach that I've taken is that what I've been doing is a kind of textual forensics, where as a historian of colonial Southeast Asia, 19th century colonial Southeast Asia, there are many excellent historians of colonial Southeast Asia who have looked at the political economy of racialized colonial capitalism, who've looked at the legal structures, who've looked at the wars, who've looked at the institutions, the legal architecture. My own approach has been a textual one, where I attempt an account of colonial Southeast Asia by studying the language of racialized colonial capitalism as embodied in these texts. Now, in the course of doing that, what I've discovered is that almost all of these texts that were written by these empire builders are deserving of a kind of deep, thorough, critical reading that I would call textual forensics, where we actually discover within the text itself blind spots, contradictions, omissions that somehow betray the internal weaknesses and contradictions of empire itself. And I think this is particularly important in the context of the post-colonial present that we inhabit today, because one doesn't simply criticize empire by engaging in a kind of simplistic, oppositional dialectics of, empire bad, post-empire good. But one has to understand, how these structures of power, these institutions of power were created. And in the process of doing so, we also need to understand the contradictions upon which these structures, rested, because empire was built on fabrications and representations that were, as Said would say, Orientalist by nature, but not simply Orientalist in that biased way. There are other structural, logical contradictions within these texts that deserve our attention. So today, for tonight, and I'm going to be as brief and as fast as I can, I want to talk about 3 books that might be familiar to you if, like me, you're interested in 19th century colonial era texts. And the 3 authors I would like to touch on very quickly tonight are Stamford Raffles and his book, The History of Java, published in 1817. John Crawford, another East India Company man, and his account of the diplomatic embassy sent to the Court of Ava in Burma, published in 1830, if I'm not mistaken, or 1829, and Henry Keppel's account of the mission of the HMS Dido that was sent to Borneo in the so-called War on Piracy, for the suppression of piracy in Southeast Asian waters, published in 1846, if I'm not mistaken. Now, in these 3 texts, what I am calling for is a thorough reading, and being an old school academic myself, I really believe that. I believe that books deserve to be read from cover to cover, a proper reading. I mean, not just the headlines or summaries, for heaven's sakes, but to actually read the book thoroughly from cover to cover, and in the course of doing so, critically analyzing the contents and the logic, the internal logic of these works, in order to unearth, what might be contradictions or blind spots within these texts themselves. So let's start, let's go backwards, and let's start with Henry Keppel. Henry Keppel's book about the voyage of the HMS Dido to the waters of Sarawak, for the sake of the suppression of piracy, is a very interesting one. On the surface of it, it's simply an account of, the mission of a British warship, the HMS Dido, that was sent to Borneo, to Sarawak, for the sake of the suppression of piracy during the so-called War on Piracy from 1830s to 1846. And it reads as a straightforward blow-by-blow account of, the voyage from England all the way to Sarawak and leading up, culminating with the attack on Brunei and Brunei being forced to sign the Treaty of Friendship between Britain and Brunei. Now, there's nothing wrong with reading the text like that. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with simply reading it, at the surface level. However, because my own background is a combination of actually, philosophy, literature, and history, I've always taken a sort of linguistic critical approach to these texts, and I've always attempted a kind of deep internal critique of the workings of these texts by reading thoroughly in between the lines and looking for these slips and these slippages that happen. And one interesting slippage that happens actually in the text itself. Now remember, the war on piracy was a very controversial war. The so-called war on piracy, was a very controversial war because back in England, its main proponent, James Brooke, was highly criticized. I mean, there was a lobby against James Brooke that basically argued that James Brooke was nothing more than a freelance warmonger who had dragged Britain into this conflict in Sarawak and ultimately with Brunei for the sake of his own personal gain. So from the outset, the so-called war on piracy was a deeply problematic one because it never defined what piracy was. And this is the interesting thing about Keppel's book. When you read Keppel's book, Keppel himself noted that he could not define what piracy was. Now, here's an account by a British naval commander whose ship had been sent to Sarawak to combat piracy. But in his own book, in his own account, he does admit that he himself, was not sure what piracy was. Now, to demonstrate this, there is actually a very interesting episode in the book itself. It's a 2-volume work. Yeah. Now, there's a very interesting episode, which for me is hugely indicative of the contradiction of the entire war on piracy at the time. And this is an event where the HMS Dido's ships encounter the boats of the Sultan of Riau, of the Natuna Islands. Yeah. And a clash takes place where the British and the Malays shoot each other, and the British boats actually do a lot of damage, and several of these Malay men on the boats of the Sultan of Riau are killed. Now, in the midst of all that, right, of all this shooting, they actually call out to each other and ask each other, "Who are you?" And the men of Riau say, "We are the subjects of the Sultan of Riau." And at that point, suddenly the fighting stops. Suddenly the fighting stops because the British naval personnel suddenly realize that the Sultan of Riau was their ally. Yeah? And so instantly, these men who a second before had been deemed pirates were now deemed allies. And what's interesting about this episode, and Keppel recounts this episode in a very lucid way, is that it demonstrates one thing to us. It demonstrates to us that the concept of piracy then was the word piracy, the signifier piracy. It's not a descriptive word sign, because piracy is not something that can be ostensibly defined in the way that you define something ostensibly. You point to objects, say this is a book. Okay, you can't do that and say that is a pirate, because piracy is not a thing. So then what this episode does is that it shows that piracy, the word piracy, is not a descriptive term but a prescriptive term, whereby to be called a pirate basically is a license to kill. And once you're deemed a pirate, yeah, then we can kill you. So piracy loses, its sort of legal meaning in this conflict, and becomes merely a means through which it's a performative thing, where once you utilize the word sign, it then opens the way for certain forms of aggression to be meted out upon the other. Now, what this episode does within this book is that this thing undermines the entire narrative of Keppel's book about the HMS Dido being in Sarawak in the name of, the suppression of piracy. Now, from there, I want to move to another book. Let's talk about John Crawford's account of his mission to Ava. Now, this is, John Crawford is a very difficult person to read because the man is repugnant, to be honest, yeah, in his speech and his writing and his opinions of Asians, of basically all Asians, and then particularly the Burmese. Now, again, as in the case of Raffles, John Crawford is not writing for the sake of the Burmese. He has a very low opinion of the Burmans in his book about his mission to the Court of Ava in Burma at the time. But one impression that you get from reading the book is that this book, which on the surface of it purports to be an account of a diplomatic mission to Burma, actually doesn't read as simply a diplomatic mission to Burma. For a start, what becomes very clear is that there is an enormous amount of data gathering going on in there because Crawford and Raffles, being functionaries of the East India Company at the time, were basically constantly in search of data because data mining is what the East India Company did. That's how it built its empire. And what is interesting is the kind of data that Crawford manages to get. It's interesting to note that Crawford, unlike Raffles, was not at all interested in the culture or the history or the society of the Burmans and the Burmese in general. But he does provide us with two types of data. Economic data, it's very interesting, for instance, that he records a lot about the resources in Burma at the time, including the discovery of petroleum in Burma. And the other thing, and this is for me very important, is he recounts in some detail the military capabilities of Burma, the Burmese kingdom at the time, because when I read Crawford's account of his mission to Burma, this for me is a book that is a preparation for war, because he constantly reiterates this theme again and again and again, the theme of Burma being a violent, hostile country that will eventually pose a threat to British interests in Bengal at the time, and of course, Penang and Singapore. And we need to ask, where does all this information come from? Now, if you were to read the text, simply read the main body of the text, the impression we get from Crawford's writing about Burma is that it's narrated to us, it's presented to us in a very matter-of-fact way that, this is Burma, these are what the Burmans are like, these are their, political, legal, institutional structures, this is the state of their armed forces, these are their defenses. He notes the defenses of Rangoon, the defenses of Ava, and that's it. But one wonders, where is all this information coming from and how? And this for me is the most important thing, because when you read the main body of the text, again and again, we get the impression, which Crawford wants to convey to us, that the Burmans are an aggressive, violent, bellicose people that are looking for a fight. They're looking for a fight with the British. Now, where does this come from? Because Crawford was not on friendly terms with the Burmans. He had a very low opinion of Burmans in general, especially the courtiers and the king who he met when he was there. Now, the answer lies, again, in the book itself, but in the appendix. And I think, that's why I call this talk the Appendices of Empire. It's in the appendix of this book that we have an enormous amount of information that is often bypassed by readers, casual readers today, because there is a tendency to regard the appendices of books as an afterthought that's not important. But again, I say it again, I take a very conservative view when it comes to these things. For me, books are meant to be read in their entirety. Now, when you read the entire work, including the long appendices at the end, then we get a very different picture. We get a very different picture because it is in the appendices of this huge work that Crawford produced that we come across something very, very interesting. And what we encounter in the appendices, there's an entire section in the appendices where Crawford reproduces in full the interviews he did with a number of European prisoners who had been captured by the Burmans during the First Anglo-Burmese War of 1824-1826. Yeah? And now, when we read these interviews, Crawford, spent some time, because remember, Crawford doesn't speak Burman, didn't speak any of the languages of Burma at the time. So the only people he could communicate with when he was on his diplomatic mission there were other Europeans, some of whom were either in captivity or had just been released from captivity by the Burmans after the end of the Anglo-Burmese War. So he meets, a number of, British men. He meets an American. He meets a mestizo, and it's with these people that he develops, this image of the Burmans as a bellicose, violent, aggressive race of Asiatics who are bent on vengeance and war. And when you read the appendices, when you read this section, this long appendix with all these interviews, it's actually very interesting to see how Crawford eventually came to the conclusion that he arrives at, and how and why he then presents us with this picture of Burmans as these very, very aggressive Southeast Asians. And by today's standards, of course, if you attended any course on journalism, you would realize that this is not how you conduct interviews. And Crawford doesn't edit any of this stuff, right? So his questions are there as well, and the questions are misleading ones. Sorry, the questions are leading questions, which in journalism you don't do. You don't ask leading questions. So an example of a leading question would be something like, you would ask these Europeans, and do you think that the Burmans are an aggressive people who want to attack us? And they would say yes. Now, so you're feeding your interviewee with the answer that you want. And he does this throughout. So when we read this appendix at the end, right, it's here that we realize that this is, the echo chamber that Crawford had created for himself. He had created this echo chamber by being a European talking to other European, a Westerner talking to other Westerners about Easterners in Burma. And it is within this echo chamber, he and his interviewees would come to, the same repeated conclusion again and again and again, that A, the Burmans are aggressive, B, that they hate the British, and C, sooner or later, there will be another war. And of course, as we know, it will then, all of this leads us to the Second Anglo-Burmese War in the 1850s. So the importance of this appendix is that it's this appendix, this section in the long appendix of Crawford's book, that shows us how this negative stereotype of the aggressive militant Burman, was constructed. It is not something that Crawford discovered while walking around the streets of Rangoon or Ava or in the countryside of Burma at the time, but rather the development of a kind of informed consensus among Westerners who had, been through a particular experience. In the case of these Westerners, they had been captives. And so the information that they provide Crawford, arms Crawford with the arguments that he needs in order to construct the image of the Burma that he wants to present to his British readers back in England at the time. But we will not know this unless we read the book in full. You won't realize this unless you read the text in its entirety, including the long appendices at the end. And now I want to go to the third and last book, which is Raffles' History of Java, Stamford Raffles' History of Java. Stamford Raffles' History of Java, of course, was the book that effectively, recast him in a new role, if you like. It gave him a new sort of public persona as a kind of colonizer, scholar, a man of culture and learning, who after his period of overlordship as Lieutenant Governor of Java from 1811 to 1816, returns to England, publishes this enormous 2-volume work, in 1817, complete with one of the best maps of Java ever made by John Walker, the famous map of Java by John Walker, and establishes, Raffles as the man, who knew the most on Java itself. And again, and Raffles doesn't shy away from making this claim, yeah. And it's recorded in his letters, for example, to his colleagues and peers at the time, where he proudly boasts of being the person who knew more about Java than anyone else in the world, even more than the Javanese themselves. And you can see this, in the map of Java that accompanies the book, The History of Java. I mean, the map is so accurate that you can still use the map today. You can actually use John Walker's map to walk, from Banten all the way to Semarang. It is that accurate. Now, of course, when we compare Crawford's book on the Burmese and Raffles' book on Java, we have two very different, stereotypes, generalized ethnic stereotypes of Southeast Asians. In Crawford's book, the Burmese are belligerent, they are bellicose, they are aggressive, they are incompetent, but they're stupid but nasty. On the other hand, in the case of Raffles' depiction of the Javanese are infantile, childlike, as he puts them. They are historically degenerate. These are his terms, yeah, historically degenerate, in the sense that they are trapped in the past. They are unable to progress. They are unable to make that leap into the age of science and technology and reasoning. They are trapped by their own history and inert, in a sense, but they're passive, they're docile, they're childlike. Two very different stereotypes of Southeast Asians, in the same region. But like Crawford, Raffles, also, produces this mammoth book that is full of data and information. And it's his attempt to demonstrate to his peers, to his fellow Europeans, his fellow Englishmen, that he was in possession of all the data available about Java itself. Now, one thing, stands out. How was this data collected? How was this data collected? Now, of course, we know that Raffles had at his disposal, the entire apparatus of the East India Company in Java at the time, when he was made Lieutenant Governor by Lord Minto. At the time, he had at his disposal, an enormous number of individuals, both British and Javanese, who served, him. Mackenzie, for example, with the excavations, the documentation of temples and monuments and what have you. But what is interesting is the amount of data on individuals, and basically the more quotidian, mundane aspects of daily normative, socioeconomic life in Java at the time. So how is this data collected? Now, again, if we read only the main text of volumes 1 and 2 of the History of Java, we will not have the answer. But again, where do we find the answer? Where are the clues? It's in the appendice. Because tucked at the back of the second volume of the History of Java is this enormous appendix. Yes, this enormous appendix, which has all kinds of information. And one of the most interesting parts of the appendix is this very long accounting of the 1814 regulations for the better governance of Java, which is an extraordinary project by any sense of the word, by anyone's imagination. What are the 1814 regulations for the better governance of Java? Well, basically, what Raffles had planned to do And this was never fully achieved because, Britain lost Java at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But the 1814 regulations for the better governance of Java was perhaps one of the most ambitious plans I've ever seen when it comes to colonial governmentality and colonial social policing ever made. The 1814 regulations, and it's an enormous set, of regulations, more than 100 of these, rules and norms and regulations, in this vast document. Basically, the 1814 regulations was a system of surveillance and complete totalized control of Javanese society from the top down, which, if you read it through a Foucauldian lens, would be, in effect, an attempt to create a kind of colonial panopticon state, which we've never seen. I've not seen, at least, anywhere else in Southeast Asia. What the regulations envisage, was the creation of a complete system of surveillance where, from the Lieutenant Governor's office, Raffles himself, all the way down, there would be two chains of command. On the one hand, regulations come from top to bottom, and data is mined from bottom and sent up. What the regulations do is basically they regulate every aspect of life of every Javanese on the island of Java. Yeah. They create a system, they were meant to create a system where every single Javanese in Java would be fixed geographically and occupationally for life. So if your grandfather was a farmer and your father was a farmer, you'll stay a farmer too. You can't change your profession. You can't change your profession without the approval of the colonial authorities. If your father lived in village A, you will live in village A as well. You can't leave village A and go to village B without the agreement of the colonial authorities. I mean, this is an amazing, panopticon state. I mean, today we talk about surveillance capitalism, and we talk about surveillance technologies and the surveillance state. Yeah, the kind of Foucauldian panopticon state where the state sees everything. Long before surveillance cameras, long before drones, long before facial recognition, Raffles was already attempting something like this in Java in 1814. So it's an amazing thing to see. I do recommend that you actually read this document to fully appreciate, the scope of this man's ambition at the time. And this then partly explains how all this data that went into the history of Java was collected, through this army of, bureaucrats and technocrats and colonial functionaries, both European and Southeast Asian, who were collaborating with them, who would, go around, gather all this material, put them together, and submit information up, to the Lieutenant Governor, thereby creating this massive data state, this colony built on data. And as in the case of, Crawford's book, in Raffles' book, the appendix is the place where we find the answers to the question, how was Java colonized? How was this system of knowledge? How was all this data gathered? Well, it's there, but it's in the appendix, right? So in all these cases, the three books I've mentioned, Keppel's book on the war on piracy, Crawford's book on Burma, Raffles' book on Java, what we find actually is what we discover are really texts that are rich. They're dense not only in terms of the language, because these are 19th century texts, but dense with information. But these were books that were written at a time when, I mean, you can't write books like that today. Nobody, no publisher, no academic publisher would allow you would publish a book of more than 400, 500 pages. What more, 2 or 3 volume books, right? It's very rare. But in those days, there was almost, it was almost a trend to write these voluminous texts, these enormous texts that crammed as much data as possible because of the awareness that data was power, information was power. And so these are books of power. That's what they are. They're books of power. But the power contained in this text, the power contained in the symbolism and the rhetoric and the vocabulary, that power can also be undermined by the contradictions within the text themselves. So Why am I calling for this sort of textual forensics? Yeah, for two reasons, and I'll end with this. The first reason is simple. The first reason is that, I think that there are many ways for us to, truly, embark on this project of decolonization of thought, right? I mean, talk about decolonization. What I mean, in the 80s, when I started as an academic, as a scholar, then as a student, at that time, there was this very unhealthy tendency, especially when I was studying in Europe at the time, where people were saying that, oh, these are books written by racist white men, and they are all, full of Orientalist cliches and stereotypes. You just should not read them at all. You should take. I mean, students were actually calling for these books to be taken off the reading list. They did not want to read Raffles. They did not want to have to read, Keppel or Mundy or Brooke or what have you. But that does nothing. That does nothing as far as decolonization is concerned, because you're just not addressing the reality of colonialism and colonial power and the logic of racialized colonial capitalism. If you're going to engage with empire in order to critique empire, you need to understand empire. So on the one hand, so there is a need for us to do that, and there is a need for us to actually understand these texts well. Yeah, and so. And I say this as, like I said, a teacher who himself is involved in decolonization. Why do I read these texts? Because these texts, like I said at the beginning, Raffles never imagined that one day, a brown man like me would be reading his book, because when he wrote the history of Java, it was not for the Javanese. When Crawford wrote about the Burmese, it was not for the Burmese. They were written for, these books were basically company reports written for the benefit of the East India Company, for the Crown of England, and for the educated, literate public back in Britain and Europe. They were not written for us. They're not written for colored people in Asia. We were the colonized subjects. We were not meant to read this. And the assumption was that we would never read them, because, like I said at the beginning, these men could not imagine that empire would end. Now, with the end of empire, right, an opportunity has opened up, therefore, for a post-colonial critique of empire by post-colonial scholars and students. And this is where I think, this is, we arrive at the historical juncture where, someone like myself now can actually read Raffles critically. And what I find in Raffles, I think, was not even, did not even register 50 years ago or 100 years ago. I mean, these contradictions were always there. They were always there, but they were never seen as contradictions, or never recognized as such when the sun of empire was shining, right? Now that empire is dead, these contradictions can be laid bare. So that's the first reason. So why do we need to read these texts in their entirety? Because it's through a thorough understanding of the logic and the language and the narratives of empire that we can actually begin to dismantle and deconstruct and decolonize empire itself. The second reason is a contemporary one. And the contemporary reason is simply this: empire is not over. As far as I'm concerned, even though, like I said, the imperial flags are gone, the imperial navies have left, we live in a world where the modalities of power, the inequalities of power, the power differentials are still there. I mean, look at COVID, for heaven's sakes, right? I mean, look at how poor countries have no access to COVID vaccines. I mean, this is the legacy of empire. This is the legacy of empire, and this is what empire has created. We live, whether we like it or not, in a world that has been shaped by the long shadow of empire, right? Now, the reason why I find reading these books today interesting is because I find in them the language and the vocabularies and the logics of empire that are very recognizable to us who live in this present world today. So let's talk about Keppel. Yeah, Keppel's War on Piracy, which I think was a completely bogus, excuse just to attack Brunei and to rob, and to steal Sarawak. Simple as that. I mean, this entire war was based on a word that could not be defined. Well, look at the world today, and we have, wars based on words, a war on terror. How on earth do you fight a war on terror? So likewise, if you can't define what terrorism is, but you can still fight a war. Yeah, you can still conduct, massive and expensive security operations on the basis of concepts that remain ill-defined. Yeah. So whether it's the war on piracy in the 19th century or the war on terror in the 21st century, these concerns remain with us. They remain with us. And I think the benefit of reading something like Keppel's War on Piracy is that it reminds us of the importance of understanding the semantics of war. Yeah. And how the vocabulary of war has always been, problematic and worthy of critique and worthy of understanding. And likewise, when you read Raffles today, and when, like I said, if you read, his appendix, in the appendix, where we have the 1814, regulations for the better governance of Java, this enormous document, yeah, we today who read this, yeah, through the lens of, say, Foucault or Bourdieu, would see that this is the beginnings of a colonial panopticon surveillance state. And surely that must be relevant to us, yeah, today, in an age of, surveillance technology and social media and facial recognition. All of this, although these things happened 200 years ago, they remain as real to us today, because the concerns are abiding and the logic, remains more or less the same. And so in conclusion, I would say that, as someone who works on, the history of empire and the history of imperialism in Southeast Asia, studying it primarily through the lens of text and textual analysis, I personally, believe that these works, and there are many works, you can think of Crawford wrote many works, for example. Yeah, his history of the East Indian Archipelago, his account of the mission of the embassy to Ava, the account of the embassy to Siam and Cochin China. Raffles wrote not only the history of Java, but several long essays about the Malays and other people, Keppel, Mundy, Marriott, John Anderson. All these books, deserve to be read critically and intelligently again today, but not in the way that they were read 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or 150 years ago. We who reside in the post-colonial present today, every generation brings a new interpretation to a text. And in the same way that you can do this to literature as well. Yeah, I mean, nobody reads Jane Austen today like, people used to read Jane Austen 50 years ago, because every generation will bring new awareness and new understandings and new sensibilities. So there is always going to be, I think, an opportunity for us to return to these texts. And I think, particularly living as we do in this very complicated world today, reading these books from the 19th century, I think, have convinced me that, I'm sorry, I'm going to quote the title of my own books, but, it's really convinced me that we still live in the long shadow of the 19th century. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It is now time for Q&A. I believe Prof. Farish has some time to accommodate the audience and their questions.
Yes, I just need to leave by 9:45 because I have another meeting after this, but we've got about 15 minutes, so yes. But if no one has any questions, I'm also quite happy to end because I've had a very long day.
I'm sure there are. It's just that somebody has to start the ball rolling.
Hi, Farish, Abedin here. Sorry, I'm not gonna share the video because it's very dark where it is. what do you make, or you say that we live in the long shadow of the, of empire. What do you make of the appropriation of empire by governments today for differing domestic political purposes, right? I'm thinking of Singapore versus Malaysia, for example, where we in Malaysia wipe out all our old road names, and in Singapore, that statue of Raffles by the river is not going anywhere anytime soon, right? So how does that, is there I think I'm not going to complicate the question. What is your take on that?
I think there are many ways in which people deal with empire, the legacy of empire, and if you were to reduce it to just these two alternatives, right? Either the negation or erasure or replacement of the imperial legacy, or in a sense, a kind of domestication and reappropriation or perpetuation of the imperial legacy. Either way, there are consequences. So just let's remember one thing. There are many countries in the world where you tear down the colonial edifices, you bring down the colonial statues or whatever, but empire is still there. Empire is still there because empire doesn't lie in the statue. Empire is there today in the context of the global economic system that we inhabit and the workings of empire. I mean, I give the example of COVID earlier, right? I mean, COVID for me is evidence of the fact that we live in a post-colonial world that's still very much shaped by the inequalities of empire and colonialism until now. So you can take down as many statues as you want. It doesn't erase anything. There's no point in bringing down statues or destroying, colonial edifices or colonial buildings if you're still going to play by the same rules of that colonial game today. On the other hand, you also have countries that have maintained, these things. And it's not just Singapore with Raffles statue, which is highly problematic and deeply contested. Another example I like to cite is actually Vietnam. I confess that I think Hanoi is the most beautiful city in Southeast Asia. And one of the reasons why Hanoi is the most beautiful city in Southeast Asia for me is that it has all these amazing buildings that were part of, whether we like it or not, the legacy of French Indochina. But when the Vietnam War came to an end, there was this feeling that, oh, the Vietnamese have finally won the Vietnam War. They're going to smash everything. They didn't. They actually kept everything. They kept everything, and that's interesting because by keeping these colonial edifices, in a way, you show that empire has ended. There's a wonderful line at the end of the movie 1900. That has Gerard Depardieu in it, and where at the end they say, the master must live in order to show that the master is dead, right? And so what happens there is that it's very different from the statue of Raffles. The statue of Raffles, in a sense, sends out a message. I mean, what does Raffles stand for? Raffles is a capitalist. Yeah, I mean, he was a proponent of racialized colonial capitalism, and so keeping the statue of Raffles there basically sends a signal. Remember, it began, at the height of the Cold War in the 60s. This was a way to say this country is not going to turn communist. Yeah, we're going to keep all these totems or fetishes of colonialism and capitalism, just to remind the West that we're not going to turn into a Cuba. So but when we look at it today, of course, like I said, every generation, goes through changes. Every generation will bring a new interpretation to it. I don't know what is the right answer. I don't know. I'm not entirely convinced that the best thing to do is to completely, destroy all these monuments or buildings or statues or what have you. But on the other hand, I'm not entirely against, renaming things, because one of the most insidious aspects of colonialism was the way in which it imposed upon native communities, local communities, a foreign vocabulary, especially place names. Especially place names, particularly for places that had already existed. So, for instance, like in India, I do understand why Madras now becomes Chennai or Bombay becomes Mumbai. And we have these debates in many parts of Southeast Asia, including, here in Malaysia. People are saying that, why do we need to call Georgetown Georgetown? Why not go back to Tanjung, which is its original name? So I think what we see, when these things happen, is that at least, one good thing is that people are talking about empire and the legacy of empire, and I think as long as the debate remains rational and healthy, it's something that is actually productive. It's better than pretending it did not happen. I think what's very important is that we should not make the mistake of thinking that empire was somehow benevolent or that it brought progress, but that it was insidious and its powers were pervasive. And we need to understand this, because in so many ways we cannot simply extricate ourselves from history and wish empire away. That's not going to happen. Like it or not, you, me, all of us, we are also, bearers of this history. The fact that we're having this conversation now in English is already proof of that, right? So.
Anyone else?
Hello, Prof. Randy here. Prof, can you hear me?
Randy, yes, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Prof. I just have a question based on your personal experience, because as you were studying abroad, studying in UK, and then you face and you encounter some of these kind of the colonial writing, and then some of the expression or image from the Western countries, that like how they write the Southeast Asia. I think in contemporary world, the transnationalism, like we can studying abroad, we can traveling abroad, also give us another way of spectrum to observe, to look back to the history. So what do you think under the context of transnationalism, or like this kind of mobility shape our experience or our understanding of the colonial past? What do you think, Rob?
Thanks, Randy. Well, I think on the one hand, okay, two things. Yeah, one, it is actually ironic, I think, that the debate on empire and imperialism and the legacy of empire is actually most active in the West, more so than in the East or in parts of Asia or Africa that were actually colonized. And I've always found this odd, right? I mean, I encountered, the works of Edward Said and Ibn Khaldun and Fanon when I was in Europe, right? Whereas, and I've been to many Southeast Asian countries, and I've taught at several Southeast Asian universities where these topics are not even discussed at all, right? So that, I think, is actually ironic that many of us actually encountered these things when we were actually in what used to be the colonial metropoles, compared to, I mean, where and when decolonization is taught, in some parts of Asia, I'm not very comfortable with it, because often it gets framed or presented in terms that are actually quite ethno-nationalists, and which again, doesn't really help us understand colonialism, right? Because this is a sort of bad anti-colonialism, which is shallow and trite and very instrumentalist, and it just serves certain sectarian agendas, because it's all couched on a very simple oppositional dialectic: they bad, we good; if they black, we white, or something like that, right? And I find that not very helpful at all. But to go back to Randy, your point about transnationalism, here's one thing that I think is very important. The most interesting, since you asked about my personal experience, my most interesting personal experience actually, when dealing with empire, was when I was at the University of Essex doing my PhD, because over there there was a very large number of South American students. Yeah. And this is a different kind of transnationalism, because we in Southeast Asia, we have our particular experience of colonialism and the impact of colonialism on our society. But remember that, the whole of South America, from Central America all the way to South America, were themselves part of the Spanish and Portuguese Empire. And they went through decolonization 100 years before us. Yeah. So that's another thing that I find very important. And I would really like to see this, yeah, when we have these debates about, colonization, legacy of empire, colonialism, and decolonization, there seems to be a very narrow, form of dialogue between East and West. In other words, Southeast Asia with Europe, South Asia with Europe. We don't talk among ourselves. And I would really like to work more with academics and scholars and students from South America, because I learn a lot when I had them as my colleagues and fellow scholars when I was in the UK in the past. So that's another kind of transnationalism, Randy, which I think is very important. By the way, for those of you who may not know, Randy is my PhD student who's actually doing a very interesting thesis looking at the perceptions of British colonialism in Malaya in the Chinese vernacular press in China at the time. So that's another kind of transnationalism that is actually very, very interesting. Perceptions of empire among Asians who are looking at other colonies in the region. Okay. I think there's one question. I'm looking at one question here.
Yes, there's one from Yicha.
Yes. I read Frank Swettenham's Malayan journals, edited Benzinko. First, inside I found simple maps of Malay and Chinese quarters. I see as prototype divided rule. Second, in his journal, they are Jawi Askara Malay language. Okay, well, I don't know who or how the language was there, but remember Swettenham, Winstead, all of these men were also linguists. Yeah, I mean, empire. One of the most important aspects of empire was learning a language, and people like Skeet and Swettenham were taught Malay, both in Malaya and in England before they came, because that was important. Now, as for the divide and rule thing, about dividing spaces, I think it's not simply a case of dividing spaces, but also arresting spaces. That's why when you read, like I said, if you read the regulations for the better governance of Java, in Raffles' History of Java, what's really interesting is that he's placing the entire population of Java under arrest. This is the amazing thing. So if you live in Kampung A, you're going to stay in Kampung A forever. If you live in Kampung B, you're going to stay in Kampung B forever. Think about this for a second, yeah? Just for a second, think about this. The population of Java at the time was estimated to be about 60 million. I mean, this is madness. How do you control that? The ambition of this project was extraordinary, but the key here is arrest. It's arrest. So you arrest a person physically in a place, but you also arrest the person occupationally in a job. You semantically and epistemologically arrest a person in terms of how you classify him. So when you read Raffles' History of Java, and you read that alongside with the regulations for the better governance of Java, what you have is a system of complete arrest. So the Javanese as a race, as a people, are historically arrested. They cannot move, they cannot evolve, because Raffles has said these people are historically degenerate, they cannot evolve. They are occupationally arrested. So this is the birth of what Syed Hussein Alatas calls the myth of the lazy native, where the Javanese are reinvented as an agrarian race. They're all farmers. They're just farmers, So you raise their history of maritime contact, you raise the history of maritime trade, and you reduce them, and you arrest them physically. You arrest them physically by keeping them in these localities. So divide and rule, to go back to the question, yeah, it's not simply divide and rule, like, putting, group A here, group B here, ethnic group C here, ethnic group D here. It's not simply keeping people apart, but it's also keeping people where they are meant to be. You have your appointed place. However, we must always remember this, yeah, most of these strategies, yeah, because they're so ambitious, never really worked, because it was not that easy to keep these communities apart. We see this in urban planning. Yeah, if you look at the urban landscape of Singapore, of Georgetown, of Medan, of Batavia, of Surabaya, there were always these attempts to keep communities apart. So Javanese here, Indians here, Chinese here, Arabs there, keep them apart. But in real life, this rarely happened. It rarely happened because communities would constantly crisscross and cross-fertilize all the time. But the ambition was there, of course. The ambition was there because that is how the logic of racialized colonial capitalism worked. Yeah, it's an arresting logic. There's a logic of seeking control over not only lands and resources, but the most important resource, which is human beings, human capital. Yeah. And again, that's why I wish people would read these books today. We live in an age of rampant capitalism. All of us, you, me, all of us, we are just units of labor. We are just consumers. We are passive consumers, to social marketing and advertising and all that. All of this, if you're worried about social media, if you're worried about the mediatic surveillance, if you're worried about data gathering and data mining, if you're worried about how Facebook is controlling your data, how Twitter is controlling your data, then go and read Raffles, for heaven's sakes. All right, because it's in the 19th century that all of this started. All of this, everything that we are seeing today has a history, but it really becomes something recognizable to us today from the 19th century onwards, because we are really living in the long 19th century, because most of the technologies, the military technologies, the economic technologies, the legal architectures that we are familiar with today date back to then. Prior to that, the 17th, 16th, 15th centuries, of course, power was there, empires were there, but they were very different empires. These were not empires that were formed on the basis of systematically accumulated data. They were not empires, formed through industry, or modern capitalism. The modern age that we live in today really dates back to the 19th century. And that's why I think it's very important for us to go back to these texts and to read them entirely. I think I said we'll end at 9:45. It's 9:44, so I have to admit my battery is low. Right, I've been having meetings from morning, and I've got another one after this. So if the chair is okay, then perhaps we can call it a night.
Well, on behalf of everyone, we thank you for at least spending this much time. What I can suggest to those who still have questions but are reluctant to voice it out, perhaps they can send emails.
Yes, of course. Yes. Yeah.
And I'm sure Prof. Farish will entertain them.
I can entertain them, but I'm not sure. I can't promise to be entertaining. But
well, so long you say yes.
Yeah.
If you don't provide your own email, you can do it through MBRAS.
Yes, yeah. Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you everyone for staying with us for an hour and a quarter. And thank you, Prof. Farish, for your time.
Okay. Thank you.
Entertainment.
Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Thanks for all of you.